The cabin went silent as the little girl stood up, inhaler in hand, walking past the flight attendants who had refused to help the dying man in first class. Her small fingers trembled, but her steps never faltered. The wealthy passengers stared. The crew tried to stop her. But this 9-year-old child was about to do something that would change everything. 8 months later, that same little girl would stand on stages across the world, cameras flashing, representing a billion-dollar brand. But nobody knew the real story of how she got there. Nobody knew about the moment when she had to choose between her own safety and a stranger's life. Nobody knew about the debt that would bind a billionaire and a child forever. This is about courage in the face of injustice. This is about a society that judges people before knowing their worth. And this is about how one act of pure kindness can shatter every barrier that stands in its way. This is the story of Akosua Mensah. Her name was Akosua Mensah. 9 years old, with bright eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than her years should allow. Her hair was done up in neat cornrows, decorated with colorful beads that clicked softly whenever she moved her head. She wore a dress that day, slightly worn at the edges but impeccably clean, made by her grandmother's hands with love stitched into every seam. Akosua lived in the Nima neighborhood of Accra, Ghana, with her grandmother Amma. It was just the two of them in a small house with peeling paint and a roof that leaked when the rains came hard. Her father worked abroad, sending money when he could, but it was never quite enough. Life was a careful balance of making do and making sacrifices. But Akosua's story, her real story, began 4 years earlier, when she was just 5 years old. That was the year her mother died. An asthma attack. Sudden, violent, merciless. Her mother had been laughing one moment, telling Akosua about the dress she was designing, her hands moving as she described the fabric, the colors, the way it would flow. And then she couldn't breathe. She reached for her inhaler, but it was empty. There was no backup. No time to get help. Akosua watched her mother's eyes go wide with panic, watched her collapse, watched the life drain from her face before the ambulance even arrived. From that day forward, Akosua carried 2 inhalers. Always 2. Because she had inherited her mother's asthma, and her grandmother Amma made an ironclad rule. 1 inhaler for use, 1 for backup. Never, ever go anywhere without both. Akosua's small hands would check her pockets multiple times a day, feeling for those 2 precious cylinders that meant the difference between breathing and suffocating. Her mother had been learning to become a seamstress, dreaming of becoming a fashion designer. She would sketch clothing designs in a worn notebook, her pencil flying across the pages, creating flowing gowns and structured jackets, traditional Kent patterns mixed with modern cuts. After she died, that sketchbook became Akosua's most treasured possession. She would trace her fingers over her mother's drawings, memorizing every line, and slowly she began adding her own sketches on the blank pages that remained. Fashion design became Akosua's dream too, the thread that still connected her to her mother. On this particular day, Akosua was about to embark on the biggest adventure of her young life. She was flying to London. Alone. For the first time ever. Her father had finally saved enough to bring her to visit for the summer, and her grandmother had scraped together money for years to afford the ticket. Amma had sold her best fabrics, taken extra washing work, denied herself new clothes and decent meals, all so Akosua could have this chance. The morning they left for the airport, Amma held Akosua's face in her weathered hands and said the same thing 3 times. "You have your inhalers?" "Both of them?" Akosua nodded each time, patting her dress pocket. "Good girl," Amma whispered, tears in her eyes. "Your mama would be so proud of you." So proud. The flight was British Airways, departing from Accra's Kotoka International Airport, destination London Heathrow. 6 hours and 45 minutes. Akosua had never been on a plane before. She clutched her small backpack like a lifeline as she walked down the jetway, her grandmother's final words echoing in her head. "Be brave, my sweet girl. Be kind. And remember, you carry your mama's spirit with you." Seat 32B. Economy class. Akosua settled into the narrow seat by the window, her backpack on her lap. Inside it was a change of clothes, some snacks her grandmother had packed, and most importantly, her mother's sketchbook wrapped carefully in an old cloth. She could feel the weight of it, solid and comforting. The plane filled up around her. Business people in rumpled suits returning from meetings. Tourists with sunburned faces and duty-free shopping bags. Families with crying babies and exhausted parents. And then there was first class, separated from economy by a curtain that might as well have been a wall between 2 different worlds. Akosua could glimpse it when passengers boarded, that other realm of wide leather seats and sparkling glasses, of flight attendants who smiled warmly and called people by name. In first class there were important people. Wealthy people. People who belonged there. Among them was a black man in an expensive suit, his presence commanding even from a distance. Akosua noticed him only briefly as she found her seat, saw the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, the way his tailored navy jacket fit him perfectly. She didn't know his name. Didn't know his story. Had no idea that in a few hours, their lives would become forever intertwined. The flight crew moved through the cabin doing safety checks. The lead flight attendant was a woman named Patricia Thornbury, mid-40s, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun and a smile that seemed painted on. She moved through first class with practiced charm, her voice lilting and sweet as she greeted passengers. Behind her was James, a younger attendant, maybe late 20s, who seemed less confident, his eyes darting around nervously as if he wasn't quite sure he belonged there either. The plane engines roared to life. Akosua gripped her armrests, her heart pounding. The aircraft began to taxi, picking up speed, and then that moment of weightlessness as the wheels left the ground and they were flying, actually flying. Akosua pressed her face to the window, watching Accra shrink beneath her, the city where her mother was buried, where her grandmother waited, where her whole life had been contained until this very moment. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Akosua pulled out her mother's sketchbook. Her hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline and nervousness mixing together. She opened to a page where her mother had drawn a gorgeous dress with traditional Ghanaian patterns flowing into a modern silhouette. Akosua traced the lines with her finger, letting the familiar shapes calm her racing heart. She had no idea that somewhere in first class, a man named Kwame Asante was settling into seat 2A, and that his story was about to collide with hers in a way neither of them could predict. Before we continue with what happens next, if you're finding this story powerful, hit that subscribe button right now. You don't want to miss how this unfolds. And let me ask you this, have you ever had to make a choice between your own safety and helping someone else? Drop your answer in the comments below. Now let's talk about the man in first class. The man whose life was about to hang by a thread. Kwame Asante. 52 years old. CEO of Asante Global Textiles. Personal net worth, $2.3 billion. But those numbers don't tell you who he really was. They don't tell you about the boy from Kumasi who started with absolutely nothing. Kwame's father had been a taxi driver who died when Kwame was 12. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Accra, and Kwame would go with her sometimes, seeing how the rich lived, the clothes they wore, the fabrics that draped their furniture and their bodies. He became fascinated with textiles, with the way a piece of cloth could transform from something ordinary into something extraordinary. At 16, Kwame started working at a small textile shop in Kumasi, sweeping floors and organizing bolts of fabric. He learned everything he could. How to judge quality. How to negotiate with suppliers. How to understand what customers wanted before they even knew themselves. By 25, he'd saved enough to open his own small shop. By 35, he owned a factory. By 45, he had boutiques in Paris, London, and New York, and his textiles were worn by celebrities and common people alike. Kwame Asante had built an empire from nothing, and he'd done it with dignity, integrity, and an absolute refusal to forget where he came from. But empires don't protect you from everything. 5 years ago, at age 47, Kwame developed adult-onset asthma. It came on suddenly, frighteningly. One day he was fine, the next he was in a hospital bed, gasping for air, doctors explaining that sometimes the body just changes, sometimes the lungs decide they need help. He managed it well with medication and a prescription inhaler that he carried everywhere. Everywhere except today. Airport security at Kotoka had confiscated his inhaler. A regulations issue, they said. The label on his prescription didn't match some requirement. He'd argued, shown them his medical documents, explained that he was Kwame Asante and could verify everything, but bureaucracy is blind to status. The inhaler was taken. They told him he could get a replacement at Heathrow, that the flight was only 6 hours, that he'd be fine. Kwame hadn't been worried. His asthma was usually mild, triggered mainly by strong allergens or extreme stress. He planned to get a new inhaler the moment he landed in London. He had an important meeting with investors, people who wanted to help him expand his youth-focused brand line globally. This was a crucial trip, and he wasn't about to let a missing inhaler derail it. So there he sat in first class, seat 2A, his distinguished appearance drawing respectful nods from other passengers. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his navy suit was impeccably tailored, cut from fabric produced in his own factory. On his leather briefcase, his initials were embossed in gold, K. Kwame Asante. A man who had made his name mean something. The plane reached cruising altitude, and Kwame pulled out his tablet to review presentation materials for his London meeting. He was excited about this new youth line, designs that would appeal to teenagers and young adults, celebrating African heritage while embracing contemporary style. It was personal to him. He wanted young people to see themselves reflected in fashion, to feel proud of their culture while being undeniably modern. About 40 minutes into the flight, Kwame felt the familiar tickle in his throat. Allergies. The recycled air on planes always made them worse. He reached for his briefcase, then remembered, no inhaler. He had allergy medication, antihistamines that would help, but he needed water to take them. Kwame pressed the call button above his seat. The pleasant chime rang through first class. He waited, not concerned, just needing that glass of water. Patricia Thornbury appeared from behind the galley curtain. Kwame noticed her smile first, bright and professional, the smile of someone trained to provide excellent service. But then her eyes landed on him and something shifted. The smile didn't disappear exactly, but it cooled, like someone had turned down the temperature in her expression. Yes, she said. Just that. One word. Flat. No, sir. No, how can I help you? Just yes, delivered with the barest minimum of civility. Kwame, ever polite, ever professional, smiled at her. Could I please have a glass of water? I need to take some medication. Patricia's eyes flicked to his suit, his briefcase, then back to his face. A calculation was happening behind those eyes, a judgment being rendered. We'll get to everyone eventually, she said, her tone suggesting he was being unreasonable for asking. And then she simply walked away. No water. No, I'll be right back. Just gone. Kwame sat there, slightly stunned. He'd dealt with this before, of course. When you're a black man, even a billionaire, even someone whose name opens doors across 3 continents, you still encounter it. That subtle shift in treatment, the way service becomes service with conditions, the way your wealth and status suddenly don't seem to matter as much as your skin. He tried to dismiss it, tried to focus back on his tablet. Maybe she was busy. Maybe he'd misread the situation. Maybe he was being overly sensitive. But deep down, Kwame knew what he'd seen. He'd seen it too many times not to recognize it. 15 minutes passed. Kwame's throat was getting drier. The tickle was becoming more insistent. He was about to press the call button again when James, the younger flight attendant, appeared with a glass of water. Here you are, sir, James said quietly, almost apologetically. His eyes wouldn't quite meet Kwame's. Sorry for the wait. Thank you, Kwame said genuinely, accepting the water. I appreciate it. James nodded and hurried away, and Kwame caught something in the young man's demeanor. Discomfort. Conflict. Like James knew something was wrong but didn't know how to address it. Kwame took his antihistamine with the water, hoping it would be enough. But as he swallowed, he felt it. A tightness in his chest. Faint but there. He took a slow breath, testing his lungs. They felt slightly constricted, like someone had wrapped a gentle hand around them and was starting to squeeze. Cabin pressure, he told himself. Just cabin pressure. It happens. You're fine. But even as he thought it, even as he turned back to his work, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. You're not fine. And you don't have your inhaler. The tightness in Kwame's chest didn't go away. If anything, over the next hour it got worse. While Kwame sat in first class feeling that ominous tightness in his chest, back in economy, Akosua was making a friend. The woman sitting next to her in seat 32A was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, with kind eyes and hands that bore the marks of a lifetime of work. She wore traditional Ghanaian clothing, a beautiful Kent cloth wrapped elegantly around her body, and she had noticed Akosua from the moment the little girl sat down. First time flying, sweetheart? The woman asked, her voice warm and grandmotherly. Akosua nodded, still clutching her backpack. Yes, ma'am. I'm going to visit my papa in London. All by yourself? You're a brave one. The woman extended her hand. My name is Efua. You can call me Auntie Efua. I'm Akosua, the girl replied, shaking the offered hand politely, just as her grandmother had taught her. They fell into easy conversation the way strangers sometimes do when trapped together in small spaces for hours. Auntie Efua was traveling to visit her daughter who worked as a nurse in London. She asked about Akosua's family, her school, her life in Accra. And Akosua, starved for motherly attention, opened up in a way she rarely did with strangers. About an hour into the flight, Akosua felt that familiar tightness starting in her own chest. Nothing serious, just the beginning of what might become a problem if she didn't address it. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out one of her inhalers, taking 2 quick puffs with practiced ease. Auntie Efua watched with concern. You have asthma, child? Akosua nodded, tucking the inhaler back into her pocket. Yes, Auntie. Since I was little. My mama had it too. Had. Auntie Efua picked up on the past tense immediately. And there, at 30,000 feet, surrounded by the hum of engines and the chatter of passengers, Akosua told her story. About her mother. About the day she died. About the empty inhaler and the panic in her mother's eyes, and how Akosua had been too small, too young, too helpless to do anything but watch. Auntie Efua listened with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. When Akosua finished, the old woman reached out and took the child's small hand in both of hers. I lost my son to asthma, Auntie Efua said quietly. 20 years ago. He was 32 years old, strong and healthy, and then one day his inhaler failed and there was no time to get to a hospital. Her voice cracked. So I understand, child. I understand your pain in ways most people cannot. They sat in silence for a moment, two people bound by the same grief, the same understanding of how quickly breath can become a luxury instead of a right. Trying to lighten the mood, Akosua pulled out her backpack and carefully unwrapped her mother's sketchbook. My mama wanted to be a fashion designer, she said, opening to a page filled with intricate drawings. She made these. Auntie Efua's eyes widened as she examined the sketches. Her fingers, gnarled with age, traced the lines reverently. Child, these are extraordinary. Your mother had a true gift. She looked at Akosua with new respect. Do you design too? Akosua blushed, flipping to pages where her own amateur attempts followed her mother's professional work. I try. I want to be a designer like her one day. You will be, Auntie Efua said with absolute certainty. I can see it in you. You have her talent and more. Akosua smiled, that rare genuine smile of a child who's been truly seen. She tucked the sketchbook away carefully and patted her dress pocket, a habit so ingrained she barely noticed doing it anymore. You checking for your inhaler? Auntie Efua asked. I have two, Akosua explained. Grandma Ama makes me carry two everywhere. One for use, one for backup. She says never ever be without a spare. Her small face grew serious. Because of what happened to Mama. Auntie Efua squeezed her hand. Your grandmother is a wise woman. A spare can save a life. Neither of them knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. 2 hours into the flight, Kwame Asante was no longer able to dismiss what was happening to his body. The tightness in his chest had intensified, spreading like fingers wrapping around his lungs and squeezing. Each breath was becoming work, an effort that shouldn't require effort. He recognized these signs. He'd felt them before, 5 years ago when his asthma first manifested, and several times since when he'd been exposed to strong allergens or forgotten his medication. This was the beginning of an attack. And he had no inhaler. Kwame tried to stay calm. Panic would only make it worse, would only tighten his airways further. He closed his eyes, focused on breathing slowly, deeply, methodically. In through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose, out through the mouth. But his lungs weren't cooperating. Each inhale was shallower than the last. Each exhale came with a faint wheeze that he could hear in his own ears. He pressed the call button. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Patricia Thornbury appeared, and this time she didn't even bother with the pretense of a smile. Her face showed pure annoyance, like Kwame was a child throwing a tantrum. Sir, we're preparing the meal service. Can this wait? Kwame tried to speak, but his voice came out strained, barely above a whisper. I need medical assistance. I'm having asthma attack. Need inhaler. Patricia's expression shifted, but not to concern. It was skepticism, almost mocking, like she was dealing with someone faking an illness for attention. She crossed her arms and actually looked him up and down, her eyes lingering on his expensive suit, his leather briefcase, his gold watch. Are you sure you're not just anxious? She said, her tone dripping with condescension. First time flying first class. The words hit Kwame like a slap. Even through his panic, even as his lungs fought for air, he felt the sting of that assumption. That he didn't belong here. That he couldn't possibly be a legitimate first-class passenger. That his distress must be some kind of performance born from being out of his element. Anger mixed with his panic, giving him a burst of strength. I owned 3 planes, he gasped out, his voice rough. I need help, now. Patricia actually rolled her eyes. Rolled her eyes at a man who was clearly in medical distress. I'll see what we have, she said, her tone suggesting she was humoring a difficult customer. And then she walked away. Not quickly. Not with urgency. She walked away slowly, leisurely, like she had all the time in the world. Kwame's breathing deteriorated rapidly after that. The anger had taken energy he couldn't spare, and now his body was paying the price. The wheeze became louder, more pronounced. His chest felt like it was in a vice, being cranked tighter and tighter. He leaned forward in his seat, elbows on his knees, trying to find a position that would let him breathe. The businessman across the aisle noticed. "Sir? Are you all right?" Kwame couldn't answer. Couldn't spare the breath for words. The businessman pressed his own call button. Then the woman behind Kwame pressed hers. Then another passenger. Within 30 seconds, half of first class was ringing for the flight attendants. James appeared first, and the moment he saw Kwame, his face went pale. This wasn't skepticism. This was recognition of a genuine emergency. "Sir, hold on, let me get the medical kit." He ran. Actually ran down the aisle to the galley, returning within seconds with a large red case marked with a white cross. He dropped to his knees next to Kwame's seat, fumbling the case open with shaking hands. Inside were bandages, antiseptics, aspirin, and EpiPen, basic first aid supplies. But no inhaler. Airlines don't typically carry inhalers in their emergency kits because inhalers are prescription medications, specific to individual conditions. James looked up at Kwame with helpless, frightened eyes. "Sir, we don't have." Kwame couldn't respond. His lips were starting to take on a bluish tint. His breathing was now audible throughout the first-class cabin, a horrible wheezing, gasping sound that made everyone who heard it deeply uncomfortable. James grabbed the intercom phone. His voice, when it came through the speakers, was tight with barely controlled panic. "Is there a doctor on board? We have a medical emergency. I repeat, is there a doctor on board?" For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Passengers looked at each other nervously. Some pulled out their phones instinctively, though there was no signal at this altitude. Kwame slumped further forward, one hand clutching his chest, the other gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles had gone white. Then a man pushed through the curtain from business class. Mid-50s, graying hair, wearing glasses and a polo shirt. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "What's the situation?" "Asthma attack," James said, stepping aside. "He said he needs an inhaler." The doctor, whose name was Richard Morrison, knelt beside Kwame and immediately began an assessment. He checked Kwame's pulse, listened to his breathing, looked at his lips and fingernails, lifted his eyelids to check his eyes. His face grew more grave with each second. "This is a severe asthma attack," Dr. Morrison announced, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "His airways are severely constricted. He needs a bronchodilator immediately." He looked up at James. "Do you have an inhaler in the medical kit?" "No, sir, we don't carry those." Dr. Morrison's jaw tightened. He raised his voice, addressing the entire first-class cabin. "Does anyone have an asthma inhaler? Anyone at all?" Silence. Passengers looked at each other, shook their heads, checked their bags to be sure. Nothing. Patricia had returned, standing at a distance, her face now showing the first signs of concern. Not for Kwame, but for herself, for the situation she was in, for the official report that would inevitably follow. Dr. Morrison turned to her. "You need to make an announcement. This is life-threatening. Someone on this plane must have an inhaler." Patricia picked up the intercom, and when she spoke, her voice still carried that same dismissive tone, like this was an inconvenience rather than an emergency. "Ladies and gentlemen, if anyone on board has an asthma inhaler, please press your call button immediately." The cabin went quiet, everyone listening for the sound of call buttons being pressed. Nothing. Not from first class. Not from business class. The silence stretched on, terrible and damning. Kwame's breathing was getting worse. The wheezing had taken on a desperate quality, each inhale a fight, each exhale a surrender. Dr. Morrison looked at Patricia with barely concealed fury. "You need to physically check," he said, his voice hard. "Walk through the entire plane. Ask every single person. This man is dying." Patricia's face flushed, but she nodded. She started toward the economy section, but even now, even with a man's life on the line, something in her body language conveyed reluctance. She walked quickly, too quickly, her eyes skimming over passengers rather than making real contact. She reached the economy section and began moving down the aisle, her question the same at each row. "Does anyone have an asthma inhaler?" But she didn't stop. Didn't wait for responses. Didn't look people in the eye. She was going through the motions, checking a box so she could say she'd done her due diligence. She passed row 30. Row 31. And then row 32 where Akosua sat with Auntie Efua. Patricia didn't even slow down. Didn't make eye contact. Just kept walking, her lips moving with that rote question, her body already angling toward the next row. Auntie Efua saw it happening. Saw this flight attendant rushing past, barely asking, certainly not listening. And she knew with the certainty of someone who'd lived through loss, that this was wrong. "Excuse me, miss," Auntie Efua called out, her voice sharp. "The child here has." Patricia turned, irritation flashing across her face. "Ma'am, please remain seated, we're handling this." "But she has." "Ma'am?" Patricia's voice was firm, cutting. "We're handling this. Please remain seated." And she walked on, leaving Auntie Efua sputtering in frustration, leaving Akosua staring after her with wide, confused eyes. Patricia made it through the entire economy section in under 3 minutes, then business class in another 2. She returned to first class, where Dr. Morrison was now looking truly frightened, where Kwame was slumped in his seat, his breathing shallow and labored. "Nobody has won," Patricia reported, slightly out of breath. Dr. Morrison stared at her. "You checked everyone? You're certain?" "I did my job," Patricia said, and now defensiveness crept into her voice. Maybe he should have been more prepared. Maybe he shouldn't be flying if... "Did you just say that?" The voice came from another first-class passenger, a well-dressed woman who looked absolutely horrified. "This man is dying and you're blaming him?" Patricia realized her mistake, but the words were already out there, hanging in the air. I'll check again," she stammered. But she didn't check again. Not really. She picked up the intercom and made another announcement, her voice flat and perfunctory. "If anyone has an inhaler, please make yourself known to the crew." And then she stood there waiting, doing nothing else. Kwame's condition was visibly deteriorating. His lips had gone from slightly blue to deeply cyanotic. His eyes were half closed, consciousness starting to slip. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing, each gasp weaker than the last. Dr. Morrison put his hand on Kwame's shoulder, his face grim. He looked up at James. "We need to divert this flight. Now, this man has maybe 15 minutes before respiratory failure. Do you understand what I'm saying? 15 minutes. James looked like he might be sick. He grabbed the phone to contact the cockpit. And in the economy section, 3 rows from the back, Akosua had heard everything. The passengers around her were murmuring, voices low and worried. The woman across the aisle was whispering to her husband about the emergency. The man in front was turned around in his seat, saying something about how terrible it was, how someone must have an inhaler, how could nobody help. And through all the murmuring, through all the concerned chatter, Akosua heard the fragments that mattered. Man in first class. Dying. Asthma attack. No inhaler. 15 minutes. Her hand moved automatically to her dress pocket. Her fingers closed around the small cylinder there. Her spare inhaler. The one her grandmother had made her promise to always keep. The one she was never, ever supposed to give away because her mother had died without a spare and Akosua could never, ever let herself be in that position. But there was a man dying. Right now. On this plane. From asthma. The same thing that had killed her mother. Akosua's mind was a storm of conflict. Her grandmother's voice, "Never give away your spare, never, never, never." Her mother's face, blue-lipped and gasping, eyes wide with panic. The empty inhaler clutched in her mother's hand. The weight of knowing that if there had been a spare, if someone had been prepared, her mother might still be alive. And then another voice, quieter but just as powerful. Her mother's voice from years ago when Akosua was very small. They'd been walking home from church and had passed a woman begging on the street. Akosua's mother had stopped, given the woman all the money in her purse, even though it meant they'd have to walk an extra mile home instead of taking a taxi. Young Akosua had asked why. Why give away money they needed? And her mother had knelt down, looked her daughter in the eyes and said, "Akosua, we help people even when it costs us. Even when it hurts. Because being human means being connected, and when one person suffers, we all suffer. Do you understand?" Akosua hadn't understood then. She was too young. But sitting there in seat 32B, hearing about a man dying from asthma, feeling the spare inhaler in her pocket, she understood perfectly. Auntie Efua noticed Akosua's distress. The child had gone very still, very quiet, her face pale and her eyes distant. "Child, what is it?" she asked gently. Akosua's voice came out small, barely audible over the engine noise. "I have an extra inhaler. I have one. But Grandma said..." Her voice cracked. "Grandma said never give away my spare. Never. Because of Mama." Auntie Efua's eyes filled with tears. She understood the weight of this choice, the impossible position this little girl was in. To risk her own safety, to break her grandmother's cardinal rule, to potentially put herself in the exact situation that had killed her mother. Your mother would be proud of you, Auntie Efua whispered, taking Akosua's hand. Whatever you decide, your mother would be proud. Akosua sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. She thought about her mother. About the sketches in her backpack. About the dreams they'd shared. About the last moment of her mother's life, gasping for air that wouldn't come. She thought about the man dying in first class. She didn't know who he was. Didn't know his name, his story, what he did, whether he was kind or cruel. She knew nothing except that he was a human being who needed help. And she thought about the flight attendant who had walked right past her, who hadn't even bothered to really ask, who had dismissed Auntie Efua's attempt to help. That's what made Akosua's decision final. The realization that if she didn't do something, if she didn't act, that man would die not because there was no inhaler on the plane, but because the adults had failed. Because prejudice and dismissiveness and carelessness had created a barrier between need and solution. A 9-year-old girl shouldn't have to be the bridge across that barrier. But sometimes the world requires courage from the smallest among us. Akosua took a deep breath. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her legs were shaking. Her hands were trembling. But her face, her small, determined face, was set with a resolution that seemed far too old for her years. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the spare inhaler. Held it tight in her small hand. And then she started walking. Walking toward first class. Walking toward the crisis. Walking into a moment that would change her life forever. Other passengers noticed. Saw this little girl with cornrows and colorful beads, walking with purpose down the aisle, her hand clutched around something. Whispers followed her. Where's that child going? Someone stop her. Is she lost? A flight attendant from the rear galley called out, Little girl, sit down. Return to your seat. Akosua didn't stop. Didn't even slow down. Her eyes were fixed ahead, on that curtain separating economy from first class, on the emergency happening beyond it. Little girl, you need to sit down right now. But Akosua pushed through the curtain, entering first class, and her voice, trembling but clear, rang out, I have an inhaler. Someone needs it. Everyone turned. The dying man in seat 2A. The doctor kneeling beside him. James with the phone to his ear. Other passengers craning to see. Aunt Patricia, standing near the galley, her face shifting from annoyance to confusion to something that might have been embarrassment. Patricia moved to intercept Akosua, stepping into her path with that same condescending expression she'd worn earlier. Honey, go back to your seat, adults are handling this. Akosua looked up at her, this woman who had walked past her, who had dismissed Auntie Efua, who had let her prejudices and impatience create this crisis. But I can help, Akosua said, her voice small but insistent. I have. Sweetie. Patricia's voice was syrupy now, painfully patronizing. We don't need your help. This is a grown-up situation. Now go sit. Wait. Dr. Morrison's voice cut through like a knife. He'd heard what Akosua said. He pushed past Patricia, moving with the speed of someone who knows seconds matter. Wait. Did she say inhaler? He dropped to his knees in front of Akosua, bringing himself to her eye level. His face was kind but urgent, his eyes meeting hers with the full attention that Patricia had never bothered to give. Do you have an inhaler, sweetheart? For asthma? Akosua nodded. She held it out, both her small hands wrapped around it like she was presenting something sacred. It's my spare, she whispered. For emergencies. Dr. Morrison took it with reverent care, like he was receiving a holy relic. He checked the label quickly, confirming it was indeed a bronchodilator, the exact type of medication Kwame needed. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you so much. And then he turned and ran back to Kwame's seat. The entire first-class cabin watched as Dr. Morrison shook the inhaler, positioned it, and administered 2 puffs directly into Kwame's mouth. Breathe in if you can, he urged. Deep as you can. Everyone held their breath. The plane seemed to go silent except for the engines. Now before we see what happens next, let me ask you something. Would you have had the courage to do what Akosua did? Would you risk your own safety to save a stranger? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this story is about to get even more powerful. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now because you need to see where this goes. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. Each one felt like an eternity. And then, gradually, miraculously, Kwame's breathing began to change. The wheezing began to ease. It was subtle at first, so subtle that you might have missed it if you weren't listening with the desperate intensity of everyone in that cabin. But Dr. Morrison heard it. He watched Kwame's chest, watched the rise and fall start to deepen, start to normalize. Another puff, he said, administering the inhaler again. Come on, that's it. Let the medication work. Kwame's body was responding. His airways, those constricted passages that had been choking off his oxygen supply, were beginning to open. The bronchodilator in Akosua's inhaler was doing exactly what it was designed to do, relaxing the smooth muscle around his bronchial tubes, allowing air to flow. 30 seconds. 45. A minute. The blue tinge in Kwame's lips started to fade, replaced gradually by a healthier pink. His chest, which had been heaving with desperate shallow gasps, began to rise and fall more steadily, more deeply. The horrible wheezing sound that had filled the cabin started to quiet, replaced by something closer to normal breathing. Dr. Morrison checked Kwame's pulse again, his face showing cautious relief. He's responding. The medication is working. He administered 2 more puffs. Just breathe, sir. Nice and slow. You're going to be all right. The tension that had gripped first class began to release. Passengers who had been clutching their armrests relaxed their grip. Some closed their eyes in relief. Others whispered quiet prayers of thanks. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the cabin, one person started clapping. Then another. Then several more. Within seconds, the entire first-class section erupted in applause, that instinctive human response to witnessing a life being saved, to seeing death pushed back by the simple act of helping. Kwame took several more puffs, each one bringing him further back from the edge. The oxygen was flowing properly now, feeding his brain, his heart, his organs. The panic that accompanies suffocation began to recede, replaced by exhaustion and confusion. His eyes fluttered open. Everything was blurry at first, shapes and colors without definition. He blinked, trying to focus, trying to remember where he was, what had happened. The last clear memory he had was pressing the call button, feeling his chest tighten, and then, darkness. Fragments. Pain. Terror. The certainty that he was going to die. What? His voice came out as a croak, rough and weak. What happened? Dr. Morrison's face came into focus above him, glasses reflecting the cabin lights, expression a mixture of professional calm and genuine relief. You had a severe asthma attack, Mr. Asante, Kwame managed. Kwame Asante. Mr. Asante. You nearly died. Your airways were completely constricted. But a young girl saved your life. Dr. Morrison gestured behind him. She had a spare inhaler. Kwame's mind struggled to process this information. A girl? What girl? He tried to sit up, his body weak and uncooperative. Easy, Dr. Morrison cautioned, helping him into a more upright position. Take it slow. You've been through a severe medical episode. A girl? Kwame repeated, his voice gaining strength. Where is she? And that's when he saw her. Standing a few feet away, half hidden behind Dr. Morrison, was the smallest child Kwame thought he'd ever seen on a plane alone. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old, with bright eyes and hair done in neat cornrows decorated with colorful beads. She wore a dress that had clearly seen better days, but it was clean and carefully pressed. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she was fidgeting with the fabric of her dress, her eyes downcast, suddenly shy in the wake of all this adult attention. Their eyes met across the first-class cabin. Kwame's and Akosua's. A billionaire and a child. A CEO and a girl from Nima. 2 people from completely different worlds who should never have intersected, whose paths should never have crossed in any meaningful way. But they had crossed. And one had saved the other. Kwame's expression transformed. The confusion fell away, replaced by something profound, something that went beyond simple gratitude. It was wonder mixed with disbelief. It was the realization that this tiny child, this little girl who probably weighed less than 70 pounds, had just given him the most precious gift anyone could give. His life. His eyes glistened with tears. Not from the asthma attack. Not from physical pain. But from the overwhelming emotion of understanding what had just happened, what she had done. But before Kwame could speak, before he could thank her, before he could even begin to process the magnitude of this moment, other voices filled the cabin. The anger had been building among the first-class passengers. They had watched the entire crisis unfold. They had seen Patricia's dismissive attitude, her slow response, her barely there effort to find help. And now that the immediate danger had passed, now that Kwame was breathing again, their fear transformed into fury. That attendant walked right past this child. The voice belonged to a white woman in her 60s, wearing expensive jewelry and designer clothes. She was pointing at Patricia with a shaking finger, her face flushed with indignation. She could have saved him 15 minutes ago. This man was dying while she just walked past. Another passenger, A businessman who'd been sitting across from Kwame stood up. I watched the whole thing. She was dismissive from the start. When he first asked for help, she treated him like he was bothering her. I saw it. We all saw it. A third voice joined in. She barely tried to help him. That announcement she made was pathetic. No urgency, no real effort. Patricia stood near the galley, her face shifting through shades of red. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for words, for some defense, for some way to deflect what was happening. I followed protocol, she said, her voice rising defensively. I made announcements. I asked. You didn't ask anyone. James's voice was quiet, but it cut through the cabin like a knife. He'd been standing to the side, holding the medical kit, watching everything. And now, perhaps finding courage in the collective outrage, perhaps finally unable to stay silent, he spoke up. Patricia, you didn't actually ask anyone in economy. You just walked through. I saw you. Patricia's head whipped toward him, her eyes blazing. She glared at him with a look that promised retribution, that told him he'd just destroyed whatever working relationship they'd had. But she was caught. They all knew it. She'd been exposed not just by passengers but by her own colleague. Dr. Morrison stood up, dusting off his knees, his professional demeanor hardening into something more severe. Someone needs to file a report about this. This wasn't just poor service. This was negligence. This man could have died because of racial bias and dismissive behavior. He looked directly at Patricia. Possibly worse than negligence. The words hung in the air, racial bias. Nobody had said it explicitly until now, but everyone had seen it. The way Patricia's smile had faded when she first saw Kwame. The way her tone had shifted. The way she'd questioned whether he was anxious, and whether this was his first time flying first class. The way she'd suggested he should have been more prepared, while he was literally dying. Kwame, still weak but gaining strength with each breath, spoke up. His voice was raspy but clear, carrying the authority of someone who was used to being heard. I will be filing a formal complaint. With the airline. With the aviation authority. And with my lawyers. He looked directly at Patricia. What happened here today was unacceptable on every level. Patricia's face went from red to pale. The reality of her situation was sinking in. This wasn't just an angry passenger. This was Kwame Asante. She still didn't know who he was, didn't understand the full weight of his influence, but she understood that he was someone who knew how to use the word lawyers with confidence. She tried to salvage something, anything. Mr. Asante, I'm very sorry. I was trying to do my job, the situation was chaotic. Don't. Kwame's voice was sharp, cutting her off. Don't apologize to me. Not now. Not when you're only sorry because you got caught. He paused, taking a breath, his eyes moving away from her. The person you should be talking to, if anyone, is the child who saved my life despite your incompetence. But Kwame wasn't interested in Patricia anymore. She'd become irrelevant to him, a problem for airline management to handle. His attention was entirely focused on the little girl still standing there, still fidgeting with her dress, still looking overwhelmed by everything happening around her. Kwame's voice softened completely, transforming from the sharp tone he'd used with Patricia to something gentle, almost tender. Come here, please. Akosua hesitated. She'd been raised to be respectful of adults, especially important-looking adults, and this man in his expensive suit with his leather briefcase and gold watch seemed very important indeed. But there was kindness in his eyes, genuine warmth, so she took a few small steps forward. What's your name, young lady? Kwame asked. Akosua Mensah, sir. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Akosua. Kwame repeated her name slowly, carefully, like he was committing it to memory. Like he was making sure he would never, ever forget it. That's a beautiful name. Akosua, you saved my life. She nodded, still not quite making eye contact. That was your inhaler? Your own medication. Another nod. My spare one, sir. My grandma makes me carry two. Always two. Kwame noticed then that her hands were trembling. Not from fear exactly, but from something else. Concern. Worry. He understood immediately. Are you scared you'll need it? Your spare? Akosua finally looked up at him, and he saw the truth in her eyes. She was scared. Of course she was scared. She'd just given away the one thing her grandmother had insisted she always keep, the one safety net that stood between her and the fate that had taken her mother. A little, she admitted, her honesty refreshing in its simplicity. But, you needed it more. Those words hit Kwame like a physical blow. She was scared, but you needed it more. This child, this 9-year-old girl who had every reason to keep her spare inhaler, who had been explicitly instructed to never give it away, who had watched her own mother die from an asthma attack, had looked at the situation and decided that someone else's need was greater than her fear. Kwame's eyes filled with tears again. He tried to blink them away, maintain his composure, but he was unsuccessful. Tears slipped down his cheeks and he didn't bother to wipe them away. "Your grandmother raised you well," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Very, very well." He reached out and gently took one of her small hands in both of his. "I have people, Akosua. I can make calls right now, have a replacement inhaler delivered to this plane the moment we land. Multiple inhalers. Whatever you need. You will not be without your medication, I promise you that." Akosua nodded, some of the tension leaving her small shoulders. Kwame looked at her more carefully now, taking in details he'd missed in his initial assessment. The worn but clean dress. The careful way her hair was done. The small backpack she carried. The way she held herself with a quiet dignity despite being clearly overwhelmed. "Where are you sitting?" he asked. 32B, sir. "In economy." "Not anymore." Kwame's voice was firm, decisive, the voice of someone who made decisions and expected them to be followed. "You're sitting here with me for the rest of the flight." Patricia, who had been standing to the side trying to become invisible, made a small sound of protest. "Sir, airline regulations state that passengers must remain in their assigned." Kwame turned his head toward her, and the look he gave her could have frozen fire. "I don't want to hear a single word from you." Each word was enunciated clearly, separately, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Not one word." Patricia's mouth snapped shut. She took a step back, her face burning with humiliation. Kwame turned to James, who had proven himself to be the only competent, caring member of the flight crew. "Help her get her things, please. And make sure she has whatever she wants for the rest of the flight. Food, drinks, entertainment, anything." James nodded immediately, relief evident on his face at being given something useful to do, at being treated with respect by this man he tried to help. "Of course, sir. Right away." He looked down at Akosua with a genuine smile. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get your bag." Akosua glanced back at first class, at the empty seat next to the man she'd saved, at the luxury she'd only glimpsed through curtains. "Really?" she asked, needing confirmation that this wasn't some kind of mistake. "Really?" Kwame said firmly. "You saved my life, Akosua. The least I can do is make sure you're comfortable for the rest of this flight." As James led Akosua back toward economy to retrieve her belongings, the other first-class passengers watched with expressions ranging from approval to admiration. Several smiled at Akosua as she passed. One woman reached out and gently touched her shoulder, whispering, "You're a hero, sweetheart." The businessman who'd been sitting across from Kwame leaned over. "That's a remarkable child. And you're a good man for recognizing it." Kwame nodded, still catching his breath, still processing everything that had happened. He looked at the inhaler still in Dr. Morrison's hand, that small cylinder that had meant the difference between life and death. "May I?" he asked, reaching for it. Dr. Morrison handed it over. "Keep it close. You'll want to use it again in about 20 minutes, just to be safe." Kwame held the inhaler carefully, reverently. It was a standard medical device, nothing special, probably cost $20 at a pharmacy. But to him, in this moment, it was priceless. He turned it over in his hands, looking at it from all angles, and noticed something. There was a small label on the side, handwritten in careful letters. "Akosua's spare. Emergency only. Grandmama. Grandmama." The grandmother who had insisted on 2 inhalers. The grandmother who had labeled this one for emergencies only. The grandmother who had tried to protect her granddaughter from the same fate that had taken her daughter. And Akosua had given it away anyway. Kwame closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the enormity of what this child had done. She hadn't just given him medication. She'd given him something that represented her own safety, her grandmother's love, her mother's memory. She'd broken a cardinal rule, defied explicit instructions, put herself at risk. For a stranger. For him. When Akosua returned with James, clutching her small backpack and looking both excited and terrified, Kwame had composed himself. He gestured to the empty seat next to him, the leather first-class seat that probably cost more than her grandmother earned in several months. "Please sit," he said gently. "Make yourself comfortable." Akosua climbed into the seat, her feet barely touching the floor. She looked around at the spacious cabin, the polished wood trim, the personal entertainment screens, the real glasses instead of plastic cups. Her eyes were wide with wonder, taking it all in. James appeared with a tray. "Can I get you anything, miss? Juice? Soda? We have some cookies or perhaps a hot meal." Akosua looked at Kwame as if asking permission. Order whatever you want, Kwame encouraged. Truly anything. May I have some orange juice, please? Akosua asked politely. And if it's not too much trouble, maybe some cookies? Of course. James said warmly. I'll bring you our best cookies. And how about a full meal? Are you hungry? Akosua nodded shyly. She'd been too nervous to eat before the flight, and the adrenaline of the last hour had left her stomach growling. I'll bring you the chicken with rice, how's that? And some fruit. Thank you, sir. James smiled. You can call me James. And thank you. You did something incredibly brave today. As James left to get the food, Kwame and Akosua sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The cabin had returned to its normal rhythm, other passengers settling back into their seats, opening books or tablets, trying to process what they just witnessed. Dr. Morrison stopped by before returning to his seat. Mr. Asante, you should use the inhaler again in about 15 minutes. And when we land, please go directly to a hospital to be checked out. Severe asthma attacks can have delayed effects. I will, Kwame promised. And Dr. Morrison? Thank you. You didn't have to help, but you did. Dr. Morrison shrugged. I'm a doctor. It's what I do. He looked at Akosua and smiled. But you, young lady, you didn't have to help either. And you're not a doctor. What you did took real courage. After he left, Kwame turned his full attention to Akosua. She was sitting very properly, very still, clearly taught not to fidget or make a fuss in public spaces. Akosua, Kwame said gently, I want you to know something. What you did today, giving me your inhaler, that's the kind of courage most adults never manage in their entire lives. She looked up at him, really looked at him, and he saw intelligence in her eyes, depth, a soul that had already learned difficult lessons about life and loss. My mama died from asthma, she said quietly. She didn't have a spare inhaler. I watched her die, sir. I was 5 years old. Kwame's heart shattered. Suddenly her choice made even more sense, carried even more weight. She knew exactly what would happen if someone didn't get help in time. She'd lived through that nightmare. And still she'd chosen to risk herself. I'm so sorry, he said, and meant it completely. That's a terrible thing for a child to witness. Grandma says I carry 2 inhalers because we never want what happened to Mama to happen to me, Akosua continued. She made me promise to always keep my spare. Always. But. She paused, struggling with the words. But I thought, if I didn't help, if I kept it and you died, then I'd be letting what happened to my mama happen to someone else. And I couldn't do that, sir. I couldn't. The wisdom of this statement, coming from a 9-year-old child, left Kwame speechless. This wasn't just courage. This was profound moral clarity, an understanding of interconnected humanity that many people live their entire lives without grasping. He wanted to say something meaningful, something equal to the moment, but James returned with Akosua's food, breaking the intensity of the conversation. Perhaps that was for the best. Some moments are too big for words. As Akosua ate her meal with careful, practiced politeness, Kwame watched her and made a silent promise. This child had given him his life. He was going to make sure that gift was honored, that it meant something, that she would never regret the choice she'd made today. He didn't know how yet. Didn't know what form it would take. But Kwame Asante was a man who understood debts, who believed in the profound importance of reciprocity and gratitude. And before we see what Kwame does next, I want you to think about something. This little girl made a choice that most of us never have to face, a choice between her own safety and a stranger's life. If you were moved by her courage, if this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next, how this billionaire repays this debt, is going to restore your faith in humanity. Click subscribe. You won't regret it. This was a debt that would be repaid. No matter what it took. No matter how long it took. Akosua Mensah had saved Kwame Asante's life. And Kwame Asante never, ever forgot a debt. Akosua settled into the first-class seat like she was sitting on a cloud. Her small body sank into leather so soft it felt like butter, so different from the stiff fabric of her economy seat. She ran her fingers along the armrest, feeling the smooth wood inlay, the chrome buttons that controlled the seat's recline and position. There was a personal entertainment screen in front of her, larger than any television in her grandmother's house. A reading light with multiple settings. A place to put her drink that folded out from the armrest. Even a small cabinet with a mirror and storage. She'd seen rich people before, of course. Accra had plenty of wealth alongside its poverty. But she'd never experienced luxury like this, never understood what it felt like to be surrounded by comfort that anticipated your every need. James returned with a tray of refreshments, But this time he was accompanied by another flight attendant, a younger woman with kind eyes who Patricia had apparently summoned from the rear galley. Patricia herself had disappeared into the crew rest area, removed from service, already being dealt with by the senior crew member who'd been notified of the incident. "Here we are," the new attendant said warmly, setting down glasses of orange juice for both Akosua and Kwame. "And I brought some cookies, some fruit and some chocolate. Is there anything else you'd like, sweetheart?" Akosua shook her head, overwhelmed by the abundance. "No thank you, ma'am. This is more than enough." The attendant smiled. "You're very welcome. And thank you for what you did. You're a very brave girl." She looked at Kwame. "Sir, is there anything else you need? More water? Something to eat?" "I'm fine thank you," Kwame said. "Just, thank you for being professional." The attendant understood the implication. She nodded and moved away, leaving Kwame and Akosua in their small bubble of first-class privacy. For a moment they sat in silence. Akosua sipped her juice carefully, trying not to spill, trying to remember all the manners her grandmother had taught her. Kwame watched her with a gentle expression, still processing everything that had happened, still feeling the residual tightness in his chest that reminded him how close he'd come to death. Finally he spoke. "So Akosua, tell me about yourself. Where are you from?" Akosua set down her juice carefully. "I'm from Accra, sir. The Nima neighborhood." Kwame knew Nima. It was one of the older, more densely populated areas of Accra, a place where people worked hard for every cedi they earned, where community mattered because resources were scarce. "And you're traveling alone to London? That's quite brave for someone your age." "I'm going to visit my papa," Akosua explained. "He works there. He's been saving money to bring me for 3 years. And Grandma Amma, she saved too. She sold her best fabrics and took extra washing work so I could have this ticket." The casual way she said it, like it was completely normal for a family to sacrifice so much for a single plane ticket, struck Kwame deeply. He'd been wealthy for so long now that he sometimes forgot what it meant to count every penny, to make impossible choices about where limited resources should go. "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman," he said. "She is," Akosua agreed, her face lighting up. "She raised me all by herself after my mama died. She works so hard, sir. She washes clothes and sells fabric at the market, and she makes the most beautiful dresses. She made this one." Akosua gestured to the dress she wore, the one that was worn but clean, simple but made with evident love. "It's lovely," Kwame said sincerely. "She has good hands. She says she learned from her mother and her mother learned from her mother. It's what the women in our family do. We make things beautiful." "And your father? What does he do in London?" Akosua's expression became more complicated, a mixture of love and longing and something that might have been disappointment. "He works in a restaurant. He sends money when he can, but it's expensive living there. He wanted to bring me sooner, but..." She trailed off, the unspoken realities of immigrant life filling the space between her words. Kwame understood those realities too. He'd built his business partly by understanding the African diaspora, the millions of people who left home seeking opportunities, sending money back, caught between two worlds. "And you mentioned your mother," Kwame said gently. "The asthma attack. How old were you when it happened?" 5. Akosua's voice went quiet. "I was 5. We were sitting together and she was showing me her drawings, the clothes she wanted to make someday. She was learning to be a seamstress, sir. She was so good at it. She could look at a dress in a magazine and figure out how to make it just by looking. And she would design her own two beautiful things." Her small hands moved as she talked, unconsciously mimicking the gestures her mother must have made, describing shapes and flows and visions of fabric transformed into art. "She was laughing," Akosua continued, lost in the memory. "And then she couldn't breathe. Her inhaler was empty. She tried and tried but nothing came out. And I just watched. I was too little to help. Too little to even understand what was happening until it was too late." Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. She'd cried enough over the years that the tears had become familiar visitors, acknowledged but not allowed to take over. Kwame felt his own throat tighten, and not from asthma this time. "I'm so very sorry, Akosua. That's a terrible thing for any child to experience. Grandma says Mama is watching over me from heaven. That she's proud of me." Akosua wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I hope that's true." "I'm sure it is," Kwame said softly. "Especially after what you did today. Your mother would be incredibly proud." They sat quietly for a moment, honoring the weight of what had been shared. Then Kwame, wanting to lift the mood, asked, "So your mother designed clothes? Is that something you're interested in too? Akosua's entire demeanor changed. The sadness didn't disappear exactly, but it was joined by excitement, by passion, by the kind of enthusiasm only children can fully access. Yes, sir. I want to be a fashion designer. I want to make beautiful clothes that make people feel special. Really? Kwame's professional interest was genuinely piqued now. That's wonderful. You know, I work with textiles and fashion. Akosua's eyes went wide. You do? You make clothes? Kwame smiled at her innocent enthusiasm. I run a clothing company. It's called Asante Global Textiles. We make fabrics and design clothing lines that are sold around the world. Around the world? Akosua could barely process this. The man she'd saved wasn't just someone who worked in fashion. He ran a company. A global company. Like, in stores? Yes, in stores. In Paris, London, New York, Johannesburg, Lagos. Many places. Akosua was quiet for a moment, trying to imagine the scale of what he was describing. Her conception of the fashion industry was limited to the small shops in Accra, the seamstresses who worked from their homes, the market stalls selling fabric. The idea of clothing being designed in one place and sold across multiple continents seemed almost magical. What about you? Kwame asked. What do you want to be when you grow up? Akosua hesitated, suddenly shy again. It was one thing to dream in private, to sketch in her mother's old notebook in the quiet of her grandmother's house. It was another thing entirely to speak that dream aloud to someone who actually lived in the world she dreamed of entering. I want to design clothes, she said quietly. Like my mama wanted to. Beautiful dresses and skirts and shirts that make people smile. That's a wonderful dream, Kwame said encouragingly. Do you draw? Design? Akosua nodded. I try. I'm not very good yet, but I practice. She paused, then made a decision. Reaching down to her backpack, which James had placed at her feet, she carefully pulled out the worn notebook wrapped in cloth. These were my mama's, she said, unwrapping it with reverent care. And some are mine. She handed the sketchbook to Kwame with trembling hands, like she was offering him something sacred. Which, in a way, she was. This notebook contained her mother's dreams, her own dreams, the visual representation of hope and loss and aspiration all mixed together. Kwame took it with appropriate reverence, sensing its importance. He opened to the first page and found himself looking at a sketch of a traditional Ghanaian dress reimagined with contemporary lines. The attention to detail was remarkable, the way the artist had captured the flow of fabric, the way patterns would interact with the garment's movement. He turned the page. Another design, this one a men's shirt that incorporated Kent cloth in an unexpected way. Another page, a woman's suit that was both professional and distinctly African in its aesthetic. These are your mother's? He asked, his voice taking on the serious tone of someone who recognized real talent when he saw it. Yes, sir. She filled about half the book before she died. Kwame continued turning pages, his trained eye cataloging what he saw. These weren't amateur sketches. They showed a genuine understanding of garment construction, of how fabric moved and draped, of the balance between traditional and modern aesthetics. With proper training, with access to resources and education, the woman who drew these could have been a professional designer. Then the style changed. The lines became less certain, more tentative. The proportions weren't always quite right. But the vision was there, the same aesthetic sense, just less refined. These are yours? Kwame asked, looking at Akosua. She nodded, blushing. They're not as good as Mama's. I know they're not. But I'm trying to learn. Kwame studied the drawings more carefully. She was right that they weren't as polished as her mother's. But they showed something else. Potential. Raw, undeveloped, but unmistakable potential. The way she'd attempted to adapt her mother's style while adding her own touches. The ambitious complexity of some designs even when the execution wasn't perfect. Akosua, Kwame said, his voice serious and sincere, these are extraordinary. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. Really? Really? Your mother had real talent. Genuine, professional-level talent. And you? He paused, choosing his words carefully because he understood how much they would mean to her. You have that same gift. You're young, still learning, but the foundation is there. The vision is there. With education, with practice, with guidance, you could be an exceptional designer. Akosua's face transformed. It was like watching the sun rise, the way pure joy spread across her features. Someone who knew what they were talking about, someone who actually worked in the industry she dreamed of joining, had just told her that her dreams weren't foolish, weren't impossible, weren't the silly fantasies of a child who didn't know better. Thank you, sir, she whispered, tears in her eyes again, but happy tears this time. Thank you so much. Kwame carefully closed the sketchbook and handed it back to her. You keep practicing. Keep drawing. Keep learning everything you can about fabrics and construction and design. And never, ever let anyone tell you that you can't do this. Akosua clutched the notebook to her chest, nodding vigorously. Kwame watched her for a moment, thinking. Then he asked, How old are you, Akosua? 9, sir. I'll be 10 in 3 months. April 15th. 9 years old. Almost 10. So young, with her whole life ahead of her, with dreams that could either flourish or wither depending on opportunity and circumstance and luck. Kwame reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a business card, thick cardstock with elegant printing. He held it for a moment, looking at it, making a decision that he somehow knew was important, was significant in ways he couldn't fully articulate yet. I'm going to give you something, he said. And I want you to promise me you'll give it to your grandmother when you see her again. He handed her the card. Akosua took it carefully, examining it like it might be fragile. The card was beautiful, minimalist but expensive, the kind of business card that communicated success and sophistication. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly with the words. Kwame Asante, Chief Executive Officer, Asante Global Textiles. Below that was a phone number, an email address, and a physical address in Accra. She looked up at him, not quite understanding the significance. She knew CO meant he was in charge, but the full weight of what that meant, the power and influence it represented, was beyond her 9-year-old comprehension. That's my personal number, Kwame said. My direct line. I want you to give this to your grandmother and tell her that I want to stay in touch with you. Okay, Akosua said obediently, tucking the card carefully into her backpack. I mean it, Akosua. I owe you my life. I don't take that lightly. That's a debt I can never fully repay, but I'm going to try. He leaned forward slightly, making sure she was really hearing him. I want to know how you're doing. I want to hear about your life, your dreams, your progress with your designs. And one day when you're ready, when you've learned and practiced and grown, if you still want to design clothes, you call me. You call that number and you remind me of this day. Akosua's eyes were enormous. Really? You mean really, really? Really, really, Kwame confirmed, smiling at her emphasis. You have courage and you have kindness, Akosua. Those qualities matter more than any design school, more than any degree. Talent can be taught. Technique can be learned. But courage and kindness? Those come from the soul. And you have them in abundance. Akosua didn't know what to say. Her 9-year-old brain was struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. This man, this important, successful, wealthy man, was telling her that he wanted to stay in her life, that he believed in her dreams, that he would help her if she needed it. Thank you, Mr. Kwame, she finally managed. Thank you so much. You're welcome. And Akosua? Call me Uncle Kwame. Mr. Kwame sounds too formal for someone who saved my life. Uncle Kwame, Akosua repeated, testing the words. They felt good in her mouth, comfortable, like they were meant to be said. They spent the rest of the flight talking, the hours passing in a way that felt both endless and far too brief. Kwame told her stories about building his business, about the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned. He told her about his first shop in Kumasi, about how he'd nearly gone bankrupt twice in the early years, about the moment when his first design was picked up by a boutique in Accra and he'd known, really known, that he might actually make it. He told her about visiting textile factories in India and China, about meeting artisans in West Africa who'd been weaving for generations, about the time he'd pitched his designs to a buyer in Paris and been laughed out of the room, only to return 5 years later with a contract worth millions. Akosua listened with rapt attention, absorbing every word, filing away every detail. She asked questions, good questions that showed she was really thinking about what he said. How did you know which fabrics to use? How did you find the right people to work with? How did you learn about business when you were just learning about textiles? And Kwame answered every question with patience and honesty, treating her not like a child who couldn't understand, but like a young person who deserved real answers. In return, Akosua told him about her life. About helping her grandmother at the market, learning to identify good fabric by touch. About watching the seamstresses in her neighborhood, studying how they cut and pinned and stitched. About sketching designs during class when she should have been paying attention to her lessons, then frantically catching up on her homework later. She told him about her dreams, the specific dreams. Not just, I want to be a designer in the abstract, but concrete visions. She wanted to create a clothing line that honored traditional Ghanaian patterns while making them accessible and fashionable for young people. She wanted to use African fabrics but design cuts that would work in any city, any climate. She wanted people everywhere to be able to wear their heritage with pride and style. Kwame listened to all of this and saw himself 30 years ago, when he'd had the same dreams, the same vision, the same absolute certainty that he could make something important if only he had the chance. The plane began its descent into London. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their approach to Heathrow, requesting that everyone return to their seats and prepare for landing. Akosua looked out the window at the clouds below them, at the patches of green British countryside starting to appear through breaks in the white. Her first international flight was almost over. Her adventure was beginning. And somehow, in the middle of it all, she'd saved a man's life and made a connection that felt significant in ways she couldn't fully name. Kwame reached over and gently touched her shoulder. "Akosua, look at me." She turned away from the window. "I'll never forget what you did today," Kwame said, his voice thick with emotion. "Never. You gave me my life back. You gave me the chance to see my children again, to continue my work, to live. That's not something that can be repaid with money or gifts or opportunities. But I'm going to try anyway. I'm going to make sure that your courage today is honored, that it means something beyond just this moment." Akosua felt tears prickling her eyes again. "I just did what Mama would have wanted me to do." "I know," Kwame said softly. "And that makes it even more remarkable. You didn't hesitate. You didn't calculate. You just acted from pure goodness and courage. The world needs more people like you, Akosua Mensah." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, the reverse thrust of the engines creating that familiar roar. They taxied toward the terminal, the London skyline visible through the windows. Passengers around them began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark, ready to continue with their lives and forget the drama that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. But Kwame and Akosua sat quietly for a moment longer, neither quite ready to let go of this unexpected connection. "You have that card?" Kwame asked. Akosua patted her backpack. "Right here." "Good. Use it. I mean that. And tell your grandmother that Kwame Asante said she's done an extraordinary job raising you." "I will, Uncle Kwame." The plane came to a complete stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around them, passengers stood, stretching, opening overhead compartments, forming the familiar chaos of deplaning. Kwame stood slowly, still feeling the aftereffects of his attack, but recovering. He retrieved his briefcase, his leather jacket. James appeared, helping Akosua with her small backpack. "Your father is meeting you in arrivals?" Kwame asked. Akosua nodded. "He said he'd be waiting right outside customs with a sign." "Good. I'll walk with you until we have to separate." Kwame looked at James. "Thank you for your help today. You showed real professionalism and compassion." James blushed. "Just doing my job, sir. And I'm sorry about Patricia. That shouldn't have happened." "No, it shouldn't have. But it did, and now it will be dealt with appropriately." Kwame's voice was firm but not unkind. "Make sure that report is thorough. What happened today could have ended very differently." "I will, sir. I promise." They made their way off the plane, Kwame and Akosua walking together through the jetway, through the terminal, toward passport control where they would necessarily part ways. Kwame to the express lane for business class, Akosua to the longer queue for economy passengers. Before they separated, Kwame knelt down one more time, bringing himself to her level. "Remember what I said. Keep drawing. Keep dreaming. And call me. I want to hear from you, Akosua. I need to know you're okay, that you're pursuing your dreams." "I will," Akosua promised. "Thank you, Uncle Kwame. For everything." They hugged, this billionaire and this child, two souls who had been strangers hours ago and were now bound together by a debt that transcended monetary value. And then Kwame stood, smiled down at her one more time, and walked away toward his gate, toward his privileged traveler's line, toward his world of first-class lounges and expedited service. Akosua watched him go, then turned toward her own line, clutching her backpack, feeling the weight of his business card inside it, carrying a hope that hadn't existed when she boarded the plane in Accra. She didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. Didn't know that 8 months later her entire world would change again. Didn't know that the promise Kwame had made wasn't just polite words but a genuine commitment. All she knew was that she'd done the right thing. That her mother would have been proud. That her grandmother's teachings had guided her to a moment of courage that would echo through the rest of her life. And that sometimes, when you give from your heart, when you help without expecting return, when you choose courage over fear, the universe finds a way to honor that choice. Before I tell you what happened 8 months later, I need you to do something. If this story has touched you, if Akosua's courage has inspired you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the next part of this story, what happens when Kwame keeps his promise, is going to absolutely blow your mind. Don't miss it. Subscribe now. Akosua Mensah walked through passport control with her head held high, ready to see her father, ready for her London summer. But the real adventure, the one that would change everything, was still to come. 8 months passed. 8 months of ordinary life, of days bleeding into weeks, bleeding into seasons. 8 months where the world kept turning, where people went about their business, where a story that had felt monumental on a plane at 30,000 feet gradually settled into the rhythm of everyday existence. Akosua returned to her life in Accra. She came back from London at the end of summer, tanned from British sun, full of stories about her father's small apartment, about riding the tube, about seeing Buckingham Palace and the Tower of London. Her grandmother had held her tight at the airport, tears streaming down her weathered face, thanking God for bringing her precious girl home safely. Life resumed its familiar patterns. School 5 days a week, wearing her uniform that was getting a bit short in the sleeves because she was growing. Helping her grandmother at the market on Saturdays, learning to haggle with customers, learning to fold fabric just so. Church on Sundays, sitting in the hard wooden pew next to Amma, singing hymns in Twi. Homework by lamplight when the electricity went out, which was often. Playing with neighborhood children in the dusty streets when chores were done. But something had changed in Akosua. Something fundamental had shifted during those hours on the plane and in the weeks that followed in London. On her dresser, next to her mother's photograph, sat Kwame's business card. She'd placed it there the day she returned, propping it up so she could see it every morning when she woke, every night before she slept. The elegant cardstock had gotten slightly worn around the edges from how often she picked it up, held it, read the words over and over like a talisman. Kwame Asante, CEO, Asante Global Textiles. She thought about that flight often. About the moment she'd stood up with her spare inhaler. About Patricia's dismissive face. About Dr. Morrison's kind eyes. About Kwame's voice, raspy but genuine, promising her that her dreams weren't foolish. About the way he'd looked at her mother's sketches with real respect, real appreciation. She told her grandmother everything, of course. The whole story spilled out in a torrent the first night home. About the asthma attack, about walking to first class, about giving away her spare inhaler, about sitting next to Kwame for the rest of the flight, about the business card, about his promise. Amma had listened with her mouth slightly open, her eyes growing wider with each detail. When Akosua finished, her grandmother had pulled her close and whispered, "Your mama is so proud of you. So proud." But when Akosua mentioned who Kwame was, showed her the business card, explained about Asante Global Textiles, Amma had been skeptical. Not about Akosua's story, she believed every word her granddaughter said. But about the significance of it all. "Many rich men make promises, child," Amma had said gently, not wanting to crush hopes but wanting to protect her granddaughter from disappointment. "They mean well in the moment, but then life takes over and they forget. Don't put too much faith in it." Akosua had nodded, understanding her grandmother's caution. But something in her heart insisted that Kwame was different, that his promise had been real, that he'd meant every word. Still, as weeks became months, as her 10th birthday came and went with a small cake Amma made and presents they couldn't really afford, as the memory of first-class luxury faded into something that felt almost dreamlike, Akosua began to wonder if her grandmother had been right. Maybe rich men did forget. Maybe promises made at altitude didn't survive the descent back to Earth. Maybe she'd imagined the depth of connection she'd felt, the certainty that something significant had happened. But even as doubt crept in, Akosua kept practicing. Every single day she opened her mother's sketchbook and drew. She sketched dresses and shirts and pants and jackets. She experimented with traditional patterns in modern contexts. She drew professional women in power suits with Kent accents. She drew young people in streetwear that incorporated Adinkra symbols. She drew children in school uniforms reimagined with West African textiles. Some sketches were terrible, amateur attempts that made her crumple the paper in frustration. But some were good. Some showed the promise that Kwame had seen, that spark of genuine talent waiting to be developed. She practiced because Kwame had told her to. Because even if he never called, even if the promise evaporated like morning mist, she would be ready. She would have done the work. She would have honored the gift he'd given her, belief in herself. Meanwhile, 8,000 miles away in his office in Accra's airport residential area, Kwame Asante hadn't forgotten. Not for a single day. Not for a single moment. He'd healed fully from the asthma attack, gotten his inhaler situation sorted out, seen his doctors, gotten a clean bill of health. His company had continued its trajectory of growth. The London meetings had gone well. The youth line he'd been planning had gotten investor approval. Asante Global Textiles was expanding, opening new markets, reaching new demographics. But through all of it, through every board meeting and design review and contract negotiation, Kwame thought about Akosua Mensah. He thought about her courage, her selflessness, her dreams scribbled in a worn notebook, her mother's designs that deserved to see the light of day. The promise he'd made at 30,000 feet that had felt, in the moment, both spontaneous and absolutely inevitable. Kwame Asante was a man who understood the weight of debts, especially debts that couldn't be measured in money. And this debt, this obligation to a 9-year-old girl who'd saved his life, was the most significant he'd ever carried. So he planned. Carefully. Thoroughly. The way he planned everything. His lawyers had filed the formal complaint against the airline within a week of the flight. The investigation that followed had been thorough and damning. Patricia Thornbury's employment was terminated, and the investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning years. Other passengers came forward. Other incidents were documented. Patricia didn't just lose her job, she was effectively blacklisted from the aviation industry. But Kwame didn't stop there. He used his influence, his connections, his status to push for industry-wide changes. He worked with aviation authorities to update medical emergency protocols. He advocated for better training on implicit bias. He donated funds to establish a program that ensured all flights carried basic emergency medications, including inhalers. He turned his near-death experience into systemic change, making sure that what had happened to him would be less likely to happen to anyone else. But that was just addressing the problem. The promise, the debt to Akosua, that required something else entirely. Something personal. Something that would honor both her courage and her dreams. Kwame's company was launching a new line, Heritage Youth Collection. Clothing designed for young people that celebrated African textiles and contemporary style, exactly the kind of fusion Akosua had described in her sketches. It was a major initiative with significant marketing budget, celebrity partnerships, influencer campaigns, the works. And Kwame knew exactly who should be the face of that brand. He told his marketing team about Akosua, about the 9-year-old girl who'd saved his life, about her mother's designs, about her dreams of becoming a fashion designer. His team had been skeptical at first. A 9-year-old brand ambassador? Unheard of. Risky. Potentially problematic from a child labor perspective. But Kwame was insistent. This wasn't about exploiting a child. This was about honoring courage, celebrating potential, and giving a deserving young person a platform she'd earned through pure goodness of heart. His legal team drew up contracts that protected Akosua completely. Limited work hours. Education requirements. Full compensation. Everything designed to support her, not burden her. His design team reviewed the sketches Kwame had photographed from her mother's notebook. They were unanimous. These designs were extraordinary. With minor technical adjustments, 3 of them could absolutely be included in the Heritage Youth Collection. Everything was ready. 8 months of planning, of legal work, of design development, of making absolutely certain that when he fulfilled his promise, it would be done right. And then, on a Tuesday evening in April, as Accra's equatorial sun was setting and casting long shadows across the Nima neighborhood, Kwame's assistant made the phone call. Amma was preparing dinner, stirring a pot of groundnut soup on her small stove, when her mobile phone rang. She wiped her hands on her cloth, frowning at the unfamiliar number displayed on the cracked screen. Hello. Good evening. Is this the home of Akosua Mensah? The voice was female, professional, speaking English with a crisp Ghanaian accent. Yes, who is calling? Amma's voice carried a note of worry. Unexpected phone calls were rarely good news in her experience. My name is Abina, and I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Kwame Asante. He has a proposal for Akosua. Amma froze. The wooden spoon in her hand dripped soup onto the floor, unnoticed. Kwame? Kwame Asante. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Kwame Asante, CEO of Asante Global Textiles. Amma's legs went weak. She groped for a chair, nearly missing it, dropping into the seat with a thud. Her granddaughter had told her about this man, had shown her his business card, but Amma had never quite believed, had never quite understood. The Kwame Asante? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The billionaire? Yes, ma'am, Abina confirmed patiently. Mr. Asante is launching a new youth line for his brand, focused on African heritage and young designers. It's called the Heritage Youth Collection, and it's going to be one of our flagship initiatives for the next 5 years. Amma couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. Her hands were shaking. Abina continued, her voice warm and kind. Mr. Asante hasn't forgotten what Akosua did for him on the flight. He never forgets his debts. And he would like to offer Akosua an opportunity to be the face of this new brand. Our youngest ambassador. She would represent Asante Global Textiles in promotional materials, at selected events, in our advertising campaigns. Amma made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Additionally, Abina went on, Mr. Asante was very impressed by the designs in Akosua's mother's sketchbook. With your permission, we would like to use 3 of those designs in the Heritage Youth Collection's first season. The designs would be credited to the late Mrs. Mensah, and Akosua's family would receive full compensation and royalties from any sales. Tears were streaming down Amma's face now. Her daughter's designs. Her beautiful, talented daughter who died too young, whose dreams had died with her. Those designs were going to be real. Were going to be made. Were going to be worn by people around the world. And finally, Abina said, Mr. Asante would like to establish an educational fund for Akosua. When she's ready, when she's old enough, she'll receive a full scholarship to the design school of her choice, anywhere in the world. In the meantime, he'll arrange for her to receive mentorship and training from some of the best designers in Africa. Amma couldn't hold the phone anymore. It slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the table. She put her face in her hands and wept, great heaving sobs of joy and disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. Akosua, who'd been doing homework in the next room, heard her grandmother crying and came running. Grandma, what's wrong? What happened? Through her tears, Amma pointed at the phone. Talk to them? Akosua picked up the phone with trembling hands. Hello. This is Akosua. There was a pause, a sound of the phone being transferred, and then a voice that Akosua recognized immediately, a voice that made her heart leap into her throat. Hello, Akosua. Remember me? Uncle Kwame? Akosua's voice came out as a squeak. Uncle Kwame, I remember. Of course I remember. Kwame's laugh was warm, rich with genuine affection. I told you I don't forget debts, didn't I? I told you I would stay in touch. Yes, but I didn't think. I hoped, but... Akosua couldn't form coherent sentences. Her brain was moving too fast, her heart beating too hard. You gave me my life back, Akosua, Kwame said, his voice growing serious. You gave me the chance to continue my work, to see my children grow up, to build my dreams. And now I want to give you your dream. I want to give you the chance to become the designer you're meant to be. And then he explained it all. The ambassador position. What it would mean, what it would require, how it would work. Limited appearances, always with her grandmother's supervision, always prioritizing her education and well-being. She would be the face of the Heritage Youth Collection, representing young African dreamers everywhere. He explained about her mother's designs. How his team had reviewed them, how they'd been unanimous in their assessment of their quality, how 3 of them would be produced for the first season. How her mother's name would be on every label, every advertisement. How the world would finally see what her mother had been capable of creating. He explained about the educational fund. The scholarship that would be waiting when she was ready. The mentorship opportunities. The chance to learn from master designers, to visit fabric mills and fashion houses, to understand the industry from the inside out. Akosua listened with tears streaming down her face, her free hand clutching her grandmother's, their fingers intertwined so tightly it almost hurt. Your courage on that plane showed me something important, Kwame said. You didn't hesitate to help someone who needed you. You didn't calculate whether it was safe or smart or beneficial to you. You just acted from pure goodness. That's the kind of person I want representing my brand. That's the kind of person who deserves to have their dreams supported. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. Plus, Akosua, your mother's designs are beautiful. They're extraordinary. The world deserves to see them. Your mother deserves to be remembered not just by you and your grandmother, but by everyone who wears her creations. She deserves that legacy. Akosua couldn't speak. She was crying too hard, overwhelmed by emotion too big for her small body to contain. Joy and grief and gratitude and disbelief all swirled together in a storm that left her breathless. Thank you, she finally managed to gasp out. Thank you, Uncle Kwame. Thank you so much. No, Akosua, Kwame said firmly. Thank you. You saved more than my life that day on the plane. You reminded me why I do what I do. You reminded me that success means nothing if we don't use it to lift others up. You reminded me that the greatest achievements come from acts of pure courage and kindness, not from profit margins or market share. He let that sit for a moment, then continued. You're going to do great things, Akosua Mensah. Not because I'm giving you this opportunity, but because you have the talent, the heart, and the courage to do great things. I'm just making sure the path is a little easier. I'm just making sure that your mother's sacrifice, your grandmother's sacrifices, your own courage, all of it leads somewhere beautiful. I won't let you down, Akosua promised through her tears. I'll work so hard. I'll make you proud. I'll make Mama proud. Oh. You already have, Kwame interrupted gently. You already have made everyone proud. Now you just need to keep being who you are. Keep drawing. Keep dreaming. Keep being the kind of person who gives away their spare inhaler to save a stranger's life. They talked for a few more minutes, working out logistics, planning next steps. Abina would visit them the following week with contracts and details. There would be a photo shoot in Lagos in 2 months, once all the paperwork was finalized. The Heritage Youth Collection would launch 3 months after that, with Akosua front and center. When they finally hung up, Akosua and Amma held each other and cried. Happy tears, disbelieving tears, grateful tears. Tears for Akosua's mother, who would never see this moment but whose spirit felt present in the room nonetheless. Tears for all the sacrifices and struggles that had led to this point. Tears for the future that had suddenly opened up before them, bright and full of promise. That night, Akosua took her mother's sketchbook and opened to the 3 designs that would be produced. She traced her fingers over the lines her mother had drawn years ago, imagining these sketches transformed into real garments, worn by real people, sold in real stores. We did it, Mama, she whispered to the sketch, to her mother's memory, to the universe. Your designs are going to be real. Everyone is going to see how talented you were. Everyone is going to know. 2 months later, Akosua Mensah stood in front of cameras in a professional photography studio in Lagos, Nigeria. She wore a dress from the Heritage Youth Collection, a stunning creation that blended traditional West African wax print with a contemporary silhouette. Her hair was styled beautifully, cornrows woven with golden thread. She smiled for the cameras with genuine joy, not the forced smile of someone uncomfortable, but the real smile of a child living her dream. The photographers, professionals who'd worked with supermodels and celebrities, were amazed by her natural presence, her ease in front of the camera, her ability to convey both youthfulness and dignity. Kwame watched from the side, his chest tight with emotion. This was right. This was exactly as it should be. 3 of her mother's designs were featured prominently in the Heritage Youth Collection's first season. Each one was labeled, Original Design by the late Mrs. Mensah, produced in loving memory by Asante Global Textiles. When the collection launched online, those 3 pieces sold out within hours. The demand was so overwhelming that they had to immediately put them into a second production run. Fashion bloggers across Africa and the diaspora wrote about them, praising the blend of traditional and contemporary, the quality of construction, the powerful story behind them. Mrs. Mensah, who had died unknown and unrecognized, became posthumously famous in Ghana's fashion circles. People spoke about her talent, her vision, her designs that were ahead of their time. And Patricia Thornbury? She never worked in aviation again. The formal investigation, the documented pattern of discriminatory behavior, the viral news story about the flight attendant who'd nearly let a man die due to her prejudice, it destroyed her career. She tried other industries, but the story followed her, a cautionary tale about the consequences of racism and negligence. But this story isn't really about Patricia. It's not even really about her getting what she deserved, satisfying as that justice might be. The story is about Kwame and Akosua. About a debt honored. About a promise kept. Kwame funded Akosua's education completely. Private school in Accra with the best teachers. Summer programs abroad. Mentorship with established designers. Every opportunity that money and influence could provide. But more than that, he treated her like family. He invited her and Amma to his home for holidays. He checked in regularly, asking about her progress, her dreams, her challenges. He gave advice when asked, support when needed, and space when appropriate. He became the uncle she'd never had, the male figure in her life who believed in her unconditionally. And Akosua flourished. Not just because of the opportunities, though those helped, but because someone had seen her, really seen her, and believed she was worth investing in. Because someone had taken her dreams seriously. Because someone had shown her that courage and kindness could be rewarded in ways that changed everything. By the time she was 16, Akosua Mensah was designing pieces for Asante Global Textiles youth line herself. Not just as the face of the brand, but as a contributing designer, her name appearing alongside established professionals. By 18, she was accepted to Central St. Martin's in London, one of the world's most prestigious design schools, with a full scholarship funded by Kwame's Educational Trust. By 22, she launched her own label, a subsidiary of Asante Global Textiles, focused on celebrating African designers and honoring her mother's legacy. And through it all, she never forgot the moment on the plane. The moment when she'd had to choose between her own safety and someone else's life. The moment when she'd learned that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Because sometimes the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Sometimes a 9-year-old girl with a spare inhaler can change 2 lives forever. Sometimes, giving away the thing you're most afraid to lose brings you everything you never knew you needed. This is the story nobody tells you about success. They talk about hard work and talent and opportunity, and yes, those things matter. But they don't talk about kindness. They don't talk about courage. They don't talk about the moments when you choose to help someone even when it costs you something precious. Akosua Mensah succeeded not because she was talented, though she was. Not because she got lucky, though she did. She succeeded because when it mattered most, when a stranger was dying and she held the means to save him, she didn't hesitate. She stood up. She walked forward. She gave what she had. And the universe, in its mysterious way, honored that choice. This story moved you? Share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Post it where people can find it. Because the world needs more people like Akosua Mensah. The world needs more people who understand that we're all connected, that one person's suffering diminishes us all, that one person's courage can lift us all. The world needs more people who carry spare inhalers and aren't afraid to give them away. The world needs more people who see someone dying and think not, what will this cost me? But, how can I help? The world needs more people who understand that the greatest success isn't measured in money or fame or power, but in the lives we touch, the kindness we show, the courage we demonstrate when it would be easier to look away. Akosua Mensah taught Kwame Asante that lesson at 30,000 feet, with nothing but a spare inhaler and a heart full of courage. And in return, Kwame Asante gave her the world. That's the story. That's the truth. Sometimes the smallest people carry the biggest hearts. Sometimes the poorest people offer the richest gifts. Sometimes the youngest voices speak the wisest words. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, if we're paying attention, if we're open to seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary, we get to witness miracles. This was one of those miracles. This was the story of Akosua Mensah. Remember her name.